noticed, I have a book to sell. So if anybody is, it's not cheap, but it is big. So see what you think at the end. 30 quid. Right, and there it is on there as well. Basically, it's a book that I had wanted to write for a very long time. I realised the other day at the book launch that I'd written the proposal for it in 2010, but just couldn't get around to actually writing the damn thing until I retired. Anyway, I retired in 2020, and there it is. I quite like the cover, but when I first started doing talks to try and kind of give it a bit of pre-publication publicity, I did a talk at Brighton Skeptics in the pub, and the image that they'd used to advertise my talk was this one, which I thought was brilliant. I would quite like to have seen that as the cover, but there you go. It's basically a popular science book about anomalistic psychology. The immediate question that arises is, what the hell is anomalistic psychology? So it is essentially the science of weird shit, but as a kind of more formal definition that we have on our website, anomalistic psychology may be defined as the study of extraordinary phenomena of behaviour and experience, including but not restricted to those which are often labelled paranormal. It's directed towards understanding bizarre experiences that many people have without assuming a priori that there is anything paranormal involved. It entails attempting to explain paranormal and related beliefs and ostensibly paranormal experiences in terms of known or knowable psychological and physical factors. And as you can see from that definition, it is a generally skeptical approach to the paranormal. And that is, over the past few decades in fact, that's been the primary focus of the research that we did at the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit at Goldsmiths in the Psychology Department, where I was for a long time. But there was another strand to our research as well, because for me an important part of being a skeptic is to always be open to the possibility that you might be wrong. New evidence might come along that makes you change your mind. And so we also had a kind of lesser strand of our research which directly tested paranormal claims. Okay, so I'm going to try and cover both of these. Obviously it's just going to be a bit of a kind of whirlwind tour. It's not going to go into any depth, but there's almost 400 pages in the books. So the first thing I'm going to do is give you a few examples of the direct attempts to test paranormal claims, and then I'll talk about the other side of our research, where we look for non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences. So the first thing I'm going to show you now is a clip from a programme that was on Channel 4 a good few years back now, presented by Richard Dawkins. I'll show you a clip and then I'll make a few comments on it.
Alleged paranormal effects. The so-called evidence for psychic phenomena is not robust, but will-o'-the-wisp. The more we look at it, the weaker it becomes. The alleged detection of water through dowsing is not obviously ridiculous. It might work, but does it? The only way to tell is through a rigorous experiment.
How does dowsing work? That's the number one question, and nobody can answer you. Well, I reckon I'm convinced that something is helping me to douse. One of the earlier chaps thinks it's God.
How do you do it? What's your principle of
I
dowsing?
think the question, and I expect God to respond in the way that I understand. I'm going to expect the right hand one to point to the camera and the left hand one straight forward.
Yeah, okay.
Look, it's following him round.
Have you done the test yet in the tent?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, and what was the result?
I was going to get 6 right, 100%.
Yeah, what happened?
1.
So what do you make of that then?
He's having his laugh, isn't he? He loves a joke.
Yes.
You don't realise.
Do I get second guys?
Oh, yeah, you can have as many.
The psychologist Chris French thinks there may be a simpler explanation. He has devoted his career to investigating claims of the paranormal. And now he has set up this test for dowsing, a properly controlled double-blind trial. In each of these rows, just one container, chosen at random, holds a bottle of water. All the rest contain sand. Neither the dowsers nor the tester are allowed to know where the water is until the boxes are opened, so there are no unintentional giveaways.
Have another go.
Safeguards like this make the double-blind trial one of the crowning achievements of scientific reason.
Number 6 again. Right. What you'll typically find when you talk to dowsers is they'll give you lots and lots of anecdotal evidence, lots of stories about how they discovered a leak in their neighbour's pipes and so on and so forth. But there are always other possible explanations there.
Yes.
What we're trying to do is set up conditions which would rule out any of those other explanations. And then we get down to the very fundamental basic issue: can the dowsers actually do what they think they can do?
Yes.
I think it's full. No, I think it's full.
So should we see how well you've done? This is sand.
In that case, I can't do this.
This is the waters in number 5. Sand again. This time, guess was in number 3. And this time you're correct. That's water. That's sand.
Yes, perhaps you come to
Final trial is sand again.
In that case, I'm 100% wrong again.
Well, you got 1 right out of 6, which is what we'd expect by chance. So far, they're performing pretty much in line with mean chance expectation, in other words, guesswork.
Yeah.
So no one has scored more than
Yeah.
2 hits out of 6.
3.
The people you've been testing, do they understand why they're being put through the double-blind procedure?
I think once we've explained it to them, then they appreciate why someone who is perhaps sceptical or doubtful about their claims would see that that was necessary. What's interesting is it doesn't actually tend to dent their confidence at all.
Which suggests that they're completely sincere.
I think they are completely sincere.
Yes.
And they're typically very, very surprised when we run them through a series of trials and actually say at the end of the day, well, your performance is no better than we'd expect just on the basis of guesswork. And then what typically happens is they'll make up all kinds of reasons, some might say excuses, as to why they didn't pass that particular test.
I feel the whole test is wrong.
I'm shocked beyond words that this has happened. But I did say from the outset, couldn't we just sort out some grey blocks and some scaffold boards so that I can walk above it, which is what I would routinely do and I've done for 40 years.
Yeah.
Who knows where or what bottles were in what tubs.
That's the whole
So
point,
that-
isn't it? That's the whole
Yeah,
point.
but if you understand dosing like I do, you'll understand that everything needs an image.
This state of denial is extraordinary. Even when confronted with hard fact, these dowsers prefer not to face up to truth, but retain their delusion.
Now, generally, we were quite happy with the way they'd edited our contribution to the programme, but there was one important thing they left out. Before we did the double-blind trials, we said to each of our dowsers, you want to make sure that the conditions work for you, so we did see what we call open trials. And in the open trials, we had a situation where, okay, here's a bottle of water, here's a bottle of sand. Make sure you get the reaction from your dowsing rods that you would expect when you pass the dowsing rods over the bottles. Over the water, the dowsing rods would cross. Over the sand, nothing. Well, that's good. Let's make sure that still happens once we put those inside our plastic containers. So, 2 plastic containers, they know that's the one with the water in, they know that's the one with the sand in. Over the water, yeah, nice reaction. Over the sand, nothing. That's exactly what they expect. So then we do the double-blind trials and their performance falls to guesswork. Now, what is it that explains why the dowsing rods cross when they know what the right answer is? It's something called the ideomotor effect. In other words, it's unconscious muscular movements. They are moving the dowsing rods themselves, but they're not consciously aware of them. Exactly the same principle as behind Ouija boards. Okay, so that's one example. There's a couple of chapters in the book that give a lot of other examples of the tests we've done, but I'll just give you another 1 or 2. This is a test that we carried out on this guy, Derek Ogilvy. Back in 2006, his career was riding high. He's a psychic, a medium. Well, a psychic, in fact. I think he does both now. And as you can see there, his USP was that he claimed that he could read babies' minds, even before they had learned to talk. And obviously he had a book out here, you can see his book, and he also had a series on Channel 5, which is the only TV channel which is named after its number of viewers. Now if you watch Derek performing on his programme, any skeptics would immediately be aware of one particular problem. He did his readings not only with the child or the toddler or the baby present, but also the parents, and they're reacting to what he's saying. So it's always possible. There's a technique known as cold reading, okay? And cold reading is a technique that can be used by deliberate con artists to convince complete strangers that you know all about them. And there's a set of techniques, really. Now it's possible that Derek, maybe even unintentionally, was picking up on the same kind of sources of information, and that was guiding his readings. So obviously that's not the best way. When he did his readings for the programme, the parents would be absolutely amazed. Now you may think, well, what's a baby going to be thinking about anyway? Is a baby, what's it just going to be, kind of, I'm hungry, or oops, I've just done a poo? What's it going to be? Apparently not. Apparently, according to Derek, these babies knew an awful lot about the state of the family business, repairs that needed doing around the house, the state of the family car, all sorts of stuff that you'd have been surprised, you know. Anyway, that was 2006. 2007, Channel 5 decided it would be interesting to make a documentary about Derek. And as you can see from the title there, The $1 Million Mind Reader, as many of you may know, James Randi for a very long time had $1 million on offer for anybody who could demonstrate psychic abilities under properly controlled conditions. And obviously some commissioning editor decided this would make an interesting programme. We'll get Derek to go for the $1 million. And so it was agreed that he would be first of all tested by us at the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit. That would be myself and Chrissy Wilson, and then he'd be flown over to Florida where he'd be tested by the late, great James Randi. So just to be absolutely clear, if he passed Randi's test, he would get a cool $1 million. Okay? And then if he passed our test, he would get a nice cup of tea and a biscuit. Both tests would obviously have to rule out the possibility of cold reading. So it's an obvious way of doing that. You get them to do the readings without the parents present. Okay? So the APRU test then. He did readings for 6 children aged between 15 and 30 months, but without the parents present. We had a registered childminder present instead. Parents were then invited to come back the next day and choose the reading which had been done for their child. Now, if Derek can really do what he says he can do, there ought to be one reading out of the 6 that's got lots of specific, accurate information about that household, about that family. So that was the idea. To pass the test, he had to get 4 or more parents, had to choose the correct reading. He didn't have to be 100% correct, but 4 or more. And I was told, as he was being driven down to Goldsmiths that day, he had described our test as being a piece of piss, which is a nice British expression for easy peasy, in case you didn't know. Okay, so, and one interesting thing happened. While he was being filmed for all this, he departed from his instructions and started doing a reading for the childminder instead of for the child. And she was quite impressed by his reading, but again, it didn't rule out cold reading as a possibility. So how did he do on the actual test? Well, before I tell you that, this is an example, this is an extract from his reading for a 2.5-year-old girl. Just an extract. The child was telling me about a car The following could be associated with one or two cars. One car has had a wheel or tyre problem on the front driver's side. This is associated with a dark colour car. There's also a scratch or sticker on this car on the lower part of the windscreen on the driver's side. She's got an eye for detail, this girl. She's only 2.5, remember? There's also been problems with the car with the rear driver's side tyre and a brake problem. On the inside of the passenger seat there's a mark or tear beside the handbrake. A door handle doesn't seem to be working all that well either. There's also a noisy exhaust. The child mentioned that there is an issue with getting a car into first gear with their parents. Now I should point, I don't know whether it's relevant or not, I should point out perhaps though that Derek himself is really into cars. May or may not be relevant, I'm not sure. So anyway, how did he actually do? The result, only one parent chose the correct reading, which is the result that you'd expect on the basis of guesswork alone. And afterwards, Ogilvy was crying his eyes out, literally. He was just, that's it, my career's over. And I was there saying, don't be silly, don't worry, your career's fine. None of your fans will take any notice of us. Which indeed he didn't. He's still performing as a successful psychic. And then, of course, he was off to be tested by the late, great James Randi. He failed that test as dismally as he'd failed ours, but the programme makers seemed to feel the need to throw a crumb of comfort out for the believers, and so they linked Derek up to an EEG machine to measure his brain waves, and the guy administering the test said, we have very unusual brain activity. If this somehow proved he had psychic abilities, which of course it doesn't. But anyway, EEG, that's science, isn't it? Okay. Right, that's just I'll give you those two examples, very different ones, because basically, you design the test around the claim, and you do it in collaboration with the claimant, and you make sure they're happy with the conditions of the test before they start. And it's only when they've signed something in advance and then gone through the test and then failed that they decide it wasn't a fair test after all. Anyway, I still sometimes come across the attitude of why are you doing this stuff, why are you interested in it? Particularly from scientists and fellow psychologists who are very sceptical about the paranormal generally. The basic attitude is, well, we all know that ghosts don't exist, we all know that people aren't being abducted by aliens, we all know that people don't have psychic powers. Well, although I would agree with each of those statements, I don't think it's true to say we all know with 100% certainty. And so we always have to be open to the possibility, as I said before, that we might be wrong. So that's the first issue. To be properly open-minded and properly scientific, we have to acknowledge the probability, however small, that maybe some of these paranormal claims are true. But more importantly, from a psychologist's point of view, the point is that there are any society you look at, anywhere around the world, at any era, there are people who claim to have had these experiences, people who claim to have these powers. They're everywhere. It's a universal part of the human experience. Therefore, either paranormal forces really do exist, and at least some of these claims would defy explanation in terms of conventional science, or we can learn a lot about human psychology by taking them seriously and trying to understand them. So that's the basic motivation. Now, one of the themes that runs through anomalistic psychology is the theme of cognitive biases. Our cognitive systems, the way we process information, it's amazing. At the moment, and I don't think it's for that much longer, but at the moment, you can do things every second of your waking life that no AI can do. Not all the things that you can do simultaneously. So, every second of your waking life, you're taking in visual information, you're forming, using that to make a mental model of the world around you and your place in it. You are recognising things, you're decoding my voice now to make sense of the meaning, if there is any, etc, etc, etc. Amazing stuff. But we do know that we all suffer from various cognitive biases that can lead us to misperceive things, misinterpret things, misrecall things. And maybe some of those biases are relevant to explaining why sometimes people are convinced that they've had a paranormal experience when maybe there are more plausible alternative explanations. That's basically what I just said. Yeah. Right. I'm going to give you really just, well, one example. There's a lot more in the book. Just one example. For example, we're all very poor at estimating probabilities. There are lots of situations in everyday life where we need to make judgments based on probabilities, and we're just not very good at it. Why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because very often the most obvious counter-explanation, non-paranormal counter-explanation for somebody's paranormal claim is maybe it was just a coincidence. So somebody has a dream, and then a little while later something happens in real life that bears a striking correspondence to the dream. Was the dream a psychic glimpse into the future, or was that match just a coincidence? Or telephone telepathy, particularly back in the day before we all had iPhones and we could see who was calling us, there have always been people who said, I know who's calling on the phone before I pick it up, even when I'm not expecting a call from that person. Is that some kind of evidence for a psychic link of some sort, or again, is the match just a coincidence? People do not like coincidence as an explanation. And I think there's several reasons for that. One is, if you're the person it happens to, there's no doubt at all it has a big emotional impact. Whether you're a believer or a skeptic, it's the kind of thing you talk about. You know, when you see your friends, you'll say, you won't believe what happened to me, and you'll give them the story. But sometimes, you may be able to make a reasonable guesstimate about what the actual probabilities are, and it might be literally millions and millions to one against the possibility that you would have had that particular dream and then that would have happened a few days later. Okay, so how can that be just a coincidence? Well, when you stop and think about it, you realise it's bound to happen. Let's just think about apparently precognitive dreams. There are over 8 billion of us on the planet. If we make the very conservative assumption that we each remember one dream per night, then that means there are over 8 billion possibilities every single night for somebody to dream about something that then appears to correspond to a future event. Sometimes a quite unlikely future event. It's the same. It's exactly the same principle. And similarly, with the telephone telepathy example, how many names go through your head in a day? How many people do you think about? And either the phone doesn't ring or the phone rings and it's somebody else. It's a non-event, you don't notice it. The phone rings and it happens to be the person you were just thinking about. Whoa, spooky. So there are lots of ways that psychologists have tried to look at this question of how good or bad are we, and do believers in the paranormal. We're all bad at this kind of task. Are believers a little bit worse? Well, there's evidence to suggest that yes, they probably are. One of the ways that psychologists have studied this, there's a load of different kind of questions that you can ask people. One of the famous ones is the birthday problem. Have you heard of the birthday problem? Right, the birthday problem. How many people would you need to have just randomly selected to have a 50-50 chance that you've got at least one pair with the same birthday? So, if you think about it, if you've got just 2 people randomly selected, you've got 1 chance in 365, yeah? We'll ignore leap years to keep it simple. If you've got 366 people, you are absolutely certain you've got at least one pair with the same birthday, because if the first 365 all had different birthdays, you've used up all the dates of the year. So that's where absolute certainty kicks in. So there's some number between 2 and 366 where you've got this 50-50 chance. If you actually ask people that question, then typically they'll give answers like, 180, 200, 120. The actual answer is just 23. That's all you need. And that strikes most people being far too low. It's a nice illustration of this problem that we have. So, we would expect, just on the basis of the law of very large numbers, that people would have dreams sometimes that appear to come true. That people will.
The problem is it's a million people who tend to have the same dream and get the reputation.
I don't want to listen to your question, John. I want to listen to the end.
Okay, listen to the end, and we can chat at the end, okay? Yeah. Right. Switching on to, like I say, that's one example of the kind of cognitive biases. There are lots of others. One of the things we got very interested in is, well, I've always been interested in as a psychologist anyway, is memory, okay? who recognises the person in the picture there? It's Uri Geller. Yes. Okay. Some people looking a bit blank. Uri Geller. Uri Geller first appeared on the scene back in the 1970s in the UK, claiming that he had these amazing psychic powers. At the time, I was a big believer in the paranormal. I was a sixth former at school. I was so excited because there were scientists saying they thought he was the real thing. Okay. He claimed he could do all kinds of amazing stuff. He could read minds. He could divine the contents of sealed envelopes. The thing that really seemed to catch the public imagination was that he claimed that he could bend metal just by gently stroking it. And so it became known all around the world. The press would often refer to him as Uri Geller, the spoon bender. Okay. There was actually a thing in the paper this week actually about him. Apparently he scratched his neck and his head fell off. That's the clean version of the joke. Anyway, okay, so I've now got lots of friends who are conjurers.
She owns the pub, it's my baby.
What's your name?
Very sorry.
All right, there. That's some very good questions.
She's sociable, sorry.
She's lovely.
You knew that was going to happen, didn't you?
I did know. Right. Yeah, I've got lots of friends now who are conjurers, and basically they can do this trick where it looks like you're stroking a spoon or a fork and it just goes all floppy, and they say it's a trick. It's sleight of hand. It doesn't involve psychic powers. And if Uri Geller is doing it using psychic powers, he's doing it the hard way because it looks exactly the same when you do it as a trick. Yeah. And Geller's never been able to demonstrate this under properly controlled conditions. But some people would object and say, no, that can't be right. It can't just be sleight of hand because I've seen him do it. And when he had finished bending the spoon or the fork or whatever it was, he put it down and it carried on bending when he wasn't even touching it. How do you explain that, skeptic? Well, my good friend Richard Wiseman is not only a skeptical psychologist, he's also a member of the Inner Magic Circle. He knows an awful lot about conjuring and magic, and he thought it was basically down to the power of suggestion. So he did a nice study with Emma Greening where they showed people a video of an alleged psychic apparently doing a spot of the old psychokinetic metal bending. And the interesting part came after he had bent the key, in this case, puts it down the table, and in one condition you hear him say, if you look closely you'll see it's still bending. The other condition is exactly the same except you don't get that verbal suggestion. Of the people who get the suggestion, 40% report they think the key carries on bending. It absolutely doesn't. People in the other group, virtually nobody does. So that was really interesting and a really big effect with a really simple manipulation. We did a follow-up experiment, this was again with Chrissy Wilson, where we were interested in something called the memory conformity effect. Basically, if you just got an account from a single witness uncorroborated by anybody else, then you probably wouldn't give that as much evidential value as if you've got multiple witnesses and they're all telling more or less the same story. And that's probably quite sensible. But something to bear in mind is, if you have got multiple witnesses to an unusual event, be it a possible sighting of the Loch Ness Monster, or a UFO, or a ghost, they are quite likely to discuss it with each other before they then do any kind of formal report. And it's possible that one person's account can influence another person's memory. And this has been shown because it's really important in a forensic context. One of my colleagues at Goldsmiths has done a lot of research in that context. We thought it'd be interesting to look at it in an anomalistic context. So we used the same video as Richard, but we added a twist. We had people watch the video in pairs, and they were told, when you watch the video, discuss it with each other and then report back to us independently. And what the genuine participants didn't know was that the other participant was a stooge, a confederate working with us, who was told during the discussion to either say it did carry on bending or it didn't. And what we found was that had an additive effect. If you got the suggestion from the psychic and you got the reinforcement from the co-witness, we got to levels of 60% of people reporting they thought the key. So it's not just what happens when you're watching something that can influence your memory, it's stuff that happens afterwards as well. Okay. Oh, I've forgotten about this bit. Yeah, I mentioned earlier cold reading. Cold reading is a technique that you can use to convince complete strangers that you know all about them, so it's obviously a very useful skill to have if you want to set up as a fake psychic. I can guarantee that the next generation of fake psychics will all have been students from Goldsmiths that did my course. I taught them all about cold reading, so now they'll know how to do it. There's a lot of different actual aspects to cold reading, but one quite important one is something called the Barnum effect. Anybody heard of the Barnum effect? I thought you might have done, sir. Right. You not heard of the Barnum effect? Barnum effect's great. Barnum effect is basically, there are certain kinds of statements that sound as if they're saying something very insightful about your innermost personality, but actually apply to everybody, or pretty much everybody. So, if I were to give you a reading just based on Barnum type statements, it might sound a little bit like this. You've got to imagine now that I'm doing this reading, it's just for you, okay? You have a great need for other people to like you and admire you. You do have a tendency to be critical of yourself. You have a great deal of unused capacity which you've not used to your advantage. While you do have some personality weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them. Disciplined and self-controlled outside, you tend to be worrisome and insecure inside. At times you have serious doubts as to whether you've made the right decision or done the right thing. You prefer a certain amount of change and variety, and become dissatisfied when hemmed in by restrictions and limitations. You pride, I like this, is my favourite line, you pride yourself on being an independent thinker, and do not accept other statements without satisfactory proof. You have found it unwise to be too frank in revealing yourself to others. At times you are extroverted, affable and sociable, while at other times you are introverted, wary and reserved. Some of your aspirations tend to be pretty unrealistic, and security is one of your major goals in life. Now, it makes a great classroom demonstration. You tell the first year students, we got a friendly local astrologer to do horoscopes for each of you on the basis of your birthdays. You give them all sealed envelopes. You get them to read the description and say, how accurate is it? And they all give it like a 4 or a 5 on a 5-point scale for accuracy. And you might say, yeah, but hang on, it is actually accurate. Most people are. If you're not like that, then you're probably a psychopath. It does describe most people. So, are they wrong? Well, no, because if you also say, to what extent do you think this describes everybody, versus it describes you as a unique individual, they feel it describes them as a unique individual, and that's where they're going wrong. And there are lots of other Barnum type statements. That's just a kind of standard profile there. So that might be why some people end up believing in the paranormal, because they've been for a reading and they've been told stuff by a psychic, and the standard line is always, they couldn't possibly have known that stuff. They couldn't know. As I say, it's not always just about personality. There's a lot more to it than that, but I've got to get on. One of the other things we're interested in are kind of strange hallucinatory experiences that people have. In particular, I've done a lot of research on something called sleep paralysis. Who's not heard of sleep paralysis? Have you all heard of sleep paralysis? Sure, I'm glad a couple of you haven't. Okay. Sleep paralysis, in its most basic form, it's just it's when you're in that state between sleep and wakefulness, and you are temporarily paralysed, and you realise you can't move. And if that's all you get, then you snap out of it and think, "Oof, that was a bit weird," and you get on with your day. But it can, and that is quite common. About 8% of the population report having experienced that at least once in their lives. There are two groups that stand out as having higher levels of incidence. That's psychiatric patients and students. And that does actually make sense, because if you've got the underlying susceptibility, you're more likely to actually experience episodes if your sleep pattern is disrupted. And those are two groups with very disrupted sleep patterns. But there can be associated symptoms that can make it absolutely terrifying. They include things like a strong sense of presence. Even if you can't see or hear anything else in the room with you, you feel definitely there is something in the room with you and it has malign intentions towards you. But you might actually hallucinate. You might hear voices or footsteps or mechanical sounds. You might see lights moving around the room, or dark shadows, or monstrous figures, or demons. You might get tactile hallucinations. You're lying there, you can't move. You can open your eyes, one of the few parts of your body, so you can see her in your bedroom, but you can't move, and you might feel something gripping you tightly and breathing on the back of your neck. I mean, you can understand why people are absolutely terrified by this. You also get difficulty breathing, typically a sense of pressure on the chest, and also intense fear. Now, if ever you talk about sleep paralysis, it's in the contract, you have to show this picture, okay? But it is a wonderful depiction of sleep paralysis. Very famous picture called The Nightingale by Henry Fuseli, painted in 1781. And you've got the horse there peering through the drapes in the background. You've got this demon on her chest. And interestingly, if you've got the underlying susceptibility to sleep paralysis, you're much more likely to actually have an episode if you sleep on your back than in any other position. Well, I mean, to be honest, sleeping in that position, she's asking for trouble. I mean, that's just silly.
Exactly.
Definitely. 10 years later, she's in the same position. She hasn't learned anything. One of the really interesting things about sleep paralysis is the way that different cultures interpret the same core phenomenon. And there are literally well over 100 different labels from around the world in different languages for sleep paralysis, and different associated interpretations, typically supernatural interpretations. So, for example, in Newfoundland, they talk about the old hag who comes and sits astride the sleeper and tries to suffocate them. In Japan, it's called kanashibari, and that translates literally as bound by iron. One of my favourites is St. Lucia, where it's this, they call it kokmar, and it's the spirits of unbaptized children that crawl onto the sleeper's chest and throttle them. So do all sleep well tonight, won't you? Back in Europe in the Middle Ages, it was sex-crazed demons who would come and have their wicked way with you while you were asleep. The male version was called the incubus, and the female version was called the succubus. To be honest, I don't know which of the two of them is the more shocked there. It's hard to say in that picture. Now, there's a link between, even though in sleep paralysis episodes you don't typically see any aliens, but there is a link between sleep paralysis and alien abduction claims. Because if you read the UFO literature, a lot of the ufologists believe that when the aliens abduct you, they can wipe your memory for most of the experience, but there might still be a few telltale signs, such as, for example, have you ever woken up in the night paralysed with a strong sense of presence and hearing, basically they are misinterpreting sleep paralysis as being evidence of alien abduction. But if you're one of the small percentage of people who has this really vivid form on a regular basis, and you either think, well, either I'm going crazy, or something weird is really happening to me, and you come across one of these explanations, it does give you an explanation, and it also means you're not crazy. So, what's the next step? You need to recover that memory. You need to get back the full memory of what the aliens did to you. So you go for hypnotic regression under the mistaken notion that it's a magical key to unlock hidden or repressed memories. It's not. It provides the perfect context for the formation of false memories. You end up with all sorts of imagery running through your head based on fantasy, imagination, prior knowledge and expectations. And it feels very real. So then you've now got the detail. If you go for hypnotic regression, expecting, you half suspect that the aliens have been taking you away, that's what you'll get. If you go expecting to find that you were Henry VIII or Mary Queen of Scots in a past life, there's a good chance that's what you'll get. If you go expecting to uncover memories of being the victim of satanic ritual abuse, there's a good chance that's what you'll get. It's the same techniques in all those different contexts that are being used. Okay, now, just to kind of finish off, another theme that runs through anomalistic psychology is the theme of top-down processing. When we interact with the world around us, we have two different sources of information. On the one hand, you've got the information that's coming in through your senses, and that, like your eyes, your ears, etc., that's referred to as bottom-up processing. But sometimes that information is ambiguous or degraded, and so to make sense of it, we also make use of what we call top-down processing. That's the way that your own beliefs, expectations, your knowledge about the world help to make sense of this incoming information. And you've got this kind of constant interaction between top-down processing and bottom-up processing to produce a mental model of the world around you and your place in it. Now it follows from this that if the information that's coming in is inherently degraded or ambiguous, top-down processing will play a relatively bigger role. And that can mean that sometimes you end up seeing and hearing things that aren't really there. And one example of this is something called pareidolia, a type of illusion or misperception involving a vague or obscure stimulus being perceived as something clear and distinct. And one of the things that we very often see is faces. Okay, we see faces in the clouds, we see faces in a stain on the floor, the pattern on the wallpaper, and most of the time we just say, oh look, you can see a face, it's not a big deal. If it happens to be a face that looks a bit like Jesus or the Virgin Mary and it occurs in a church or a religious setting, people can come from thousands of miles away to come and witness it. So this is just a few fairly light-hearted examples, some of my favourite examples of pareidolia. This is a very famous example of a cinnamon bun. Some people think there's a striking resemblance to Mother Teresa. So that's Nun or Bun, the Immaculate Confection. A little animation there, so it's quite a good likeness actually. This is another more recent example of a grilled cheese sandwich that someone took a bite from and then thought they could see the Madonna looking back at them. So they put it in a little plastic container on their bedside cabinet for 10 years and then sold it for $28,000 on eBay. So it's worth keeping your eyes open, folks.
Yeah.
Now the most powerful example of the influence of top-down processing that I have come across is in the auditory domain. It relates to the idea put about by a lot of American Christian fundamentalists that there are satanic messages in rock music. But they believe you can only hear these messages when you play the record backwards. Now there are websites you can go to, and I strongly recommend that you waste some of your time on these websites because they're great fun. What you'll typically find, you can play these clips and you typically can't hear what the message is until you either read it or someone tells you. And then you play it again and you think, oh yeah, it does kind of sound like that, doesn't it? And so obviously, some of the clips are not very convincing, some of them, there has to be a top of the satanic pops. And in my humble opinion, it is a clip from Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. Now I'm going to play it for you. First of all, I'm going to play it forwards for no other reason than I like it. Then I'm going to play it backwards, and your task will be to tell me what you think the hidden message is. And basically, my prediction is that it will sound like backwards gobbledygook. Now, there's a very good reason for that. It's because it is backwards gobbledygook.
That's like I Buried Paul, right?
It's exactly like that, yep. But one or two of you might think you hear one or two words. Well, most of it, even to those people, will still sound like backwards gobbledygook. I will then tell you what the message is, and I'll play it again. I promise it's the same sound file, but the second time I play it, it will sound completely different, and you will hear the hidden message as clear as a bell. And you'll wonder how you missed it the first time. The reason you missed it the first time is because it isn't there, okay? So first of all then, let's just play it forwards.
If there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alone there. It's just a sprinkling for the May Queen. Yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road.
Okay, now just remember, under the guidelines of the British Psychological Society, if you do not want to take the risk of becoming the next recruit to Satan's army, leave the room now. So if you're prepared to take the risk, you have been warned. Okay. So, your task now, what's the hidden message? Anybody?
Satan.
Satan! Yes! Satan! And again, top-down processing, what's the word you're most likely to hear when I'm talking about satanic messages? It's Satan. But apparently, to the people who believe in this nonsense, that's the full message. Here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose little path would make me sad, whose power is Satan. He'll give you 666, supposedly the devil's number. There was a little tool shed, I can explain the tool shed, where he made us suffer, sad Satan. I'm now going to play it again, and you will hear the message as clear as a bell. I never get tired of it. You've seen me play it about 60 times, haven't you? Yeah. Anyway, that's it. That's the end of it. So thank you very much. If anybody's interested in buying a book.